Hello, I'm Ellen Sentier, and this is Celtic Noir. And I'm about to tell you a story, as I usually do every Wednesday. Now, today's story is going to be a very old one that I've rewritten for myself years ago. And so here you go. It's called Shining Brow, and it's about the birth and the coming into being of Taliesin. But let's do the story. Shining Brow. Long ago and far away, there lived a woman named Ceridwen. Ceridwen had a son and a daughter. Her daughter, Crowry, she was so beautiful, the most beautiful maiden in the whole world. But her son, oh dear, her son was not beautiful. He was called Morfran, which means great crow, but everyone called him Akfaru, utter darkness. He was so ugly. Ceridwen was very, very distressed. He was her dear son, and yet everyone who looked at him was disgusted and horrified. And her daughter was indeed fair enough, but that was no help at all. Her son, the great crow, was ugly. What can I do for him? She mused to herself. The sun was shining and the herbs smelled sweet. What shall I do for him? She sang. A robin bounced up onto a nearby branch. Knowing, he said. That's what he needs. A good dose of knowing. And with that, he flew off. Ah, thought Ceridwen. That's it. I'll give him all the knowing of everything that is in this world. Then, when he speaks, people will listen to his words and not know that. It's about gathering herbs. Time she got, for where would the world be without time? She took pieces of paper and placed them in her cauldron, and in between each sheet she sprinkled thyme. This is not paper which I've cut, but money, and in this pot I put. Time upon it I sow, now to keep it safe and grow. And she stirred as she poured in some moonshine. Then there was Rosemary, her remembrance. For what was the use of her darling crow knowing everything if he could remember nothing? And sage she got for its name alone, for this herb brings wisdom. And it would cleanse out all the rubbish and pain that filled her crow's mind and leave him free for inspiration to enter. Vervain she picked with her left hand just as the dog star climbed the sky, and she was careful to leave a honeycomb in payment. For it eases aching eyes and gives clear vision, so the Druids say, she whispered. And true prophecy too, and my crow will need that. And mistletoe she took on the 6th day after the full moon. Here's truth, she said, and truth speaker and truth seer thou shalt be. And she put it into her cauldron. And so she cut and carried the herbs which would inspire her son. And then she journeyed down into the underworld and spoke to the great antlered one who is guardian there. Give me, she asked, a tiny piece of the essence of every animal and bird and fish and flying thing and crawling thing and burrowing thing and swimming thing and running thing that lives in our middle world. And what will you use it for? And I give it to you, he asked her back. 'Tis for my son, my great crow. I would have him know the essence of every living creature in the middle world, so that he will be admired, and none will think to call note to his ugliness. And will he use his knowing wisely? Demanded the great antlered one. Aye, that you will, cried Corydwin, for I have put in all the herbs of truth and honesty and wisdom into the brew I mix. So Gwyn gave her the essence that she wanted, which contained all the living creatures who partake of life on Middle-earth. Corydwin carried it carefully in a pouch next to her heart and took it home, and she stirred it into the pot with another cup of moonshine. And then she climbed and climbed up the trunk and branches of the great oak tree, which holds up the world. Farther and higher she climbed, until her breath was ragged and her limbs ached. And at last she saw it, spinning in the distance, shimmering so that she could not long hold her eyes on it. And wearily she made her way to the door. There was no answer to her knocking, not for some while. And then, as she leaned against the door, it slowly creaked open. She was inside a great hall. Shining stalactites and stalagmites twined together to hold up the arching roof. Crystals caught the light of the moon and reflected it back, each to each. The shadows wove themselves around her so that she could no longer see the floor that she thought she stood on. "Moon Lady," she cried, "Arianrod, where are you, sister, when I need you?" And there was a rustling and stirring among the shadows. And screwing up her eyes, Corydwin saw the white foot step out of the gloaming, and her sister's tall, willowy form follow hard upon its heel. "What wilt thou have of me, sister?" asked Arianrod, her voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I want the knowledge of the moon and stars for my blighted son, my dearest crow," Corydwin answered. "Ha!" And Ariadne laughed. "Why should I give thee aught for that monster that spewed out from between thy legs?" Ceridwen fought down an urge to scratch out the beautiful eyes that were full of starlight and coldness, and laughed down at her. "Because he is ugly, because he has nothing except the ridicule of all men. If he has all the wisdom and all the knowing of all the worlds, then men will look up to him, and it will no longer matter if he is ugly." "What is that to me, sister?" "Because I am your sister, and because sometimes you too have to enter into the worlds of utter darkness, and so will need a friend." Eanrod stood and thought. Inwardly, she smiled. Perhaps she would gain by doing this little favor for her sister, and who could tell how it might turn out? "Here!" She reached into the firmament and pulled out a handful of stardust. "Here, quickly, take it before it shimmers away into nothing." And Ceridwen took the golden stardust and put the pouch next to her heart. She leapt her way down the oak tree and ran all the way back to her home. And the stardust glittered wickedly as it sprang in among the other ingredients in the cauldron. "Now it must be stirred for a year and a day," Ceridwen said. "But who shall stir it? For I cannot." She went down and crossed the river into the little town of Llanfair in Powys. And there she found the boy Gwion playing by himself. "Since thou hast naught to do but play, come earn thy bread with me, and stir my cauldron," she said to him. And she took also with her the old man Morda, who had nothing to do either, to stoke the fire whilst Gwion stirred. Gwion stirred and stirred and stirred. It was grievous hard work, for the cauldron was very large, and Ceridwen would not let either of them stop for a moment. But Gwion kept his pace and stirred manfully for the whole year and a day until, just in the very last hour, the very last moment even, the cauldron bubbled. It bubbled and began to shake, and great waves rose and fell across the surface of the brew, and it began to spit and trouble itself as though it were giving birth. And then, just as Gwion Bark was hanging over the side to try and hold the stirring paddle safe, three great drops spurted up out of the cauldron, right onto his thumb. Ah! Gwion Bark cried out, for the brew was boiling hot, and his thumb hurt very much, and he stuck his thumb in his mouth. For a moment, nothing happened at all. And then the cauldron rumbled and shook, and with a great shrieking tearing of metal, it broke itself in two. And all the brew, the rich brew which Gwion had been stirring for a year and a day, it all tumbled out and poured down the hill into the river. And King Melgwyn's horses were there, taking their evening drink, and as the cauldron brew fell into the water, so the water was poisoned, and all the horses fell down dead. Needless to say, King Melgwyn was not pleased. Finally, inspiration struck Gwion Bark, and he realized that he had taken the potion that was meant for Morfran, the great crow who was called Axfalu. He knew Ceridwen would not be at all pleased. In fact, she'd be furiously angry. Gwion put a run, out of the house and down the hill. He ran and he ran and he ran, and then he realized he was running on four legs, leaping with great strong hind legs and steadying himself with delicate forepaws. And now he could hear Ceridwen too, pounding along, da-dum, 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 because his ears had become as long. So he heard her great paws following him and the rasping breath behind her lolling tongue. For he knew that she had become a greyhound and was chasing him. See, too, that he had become a hare and was racing along the meadow, heading for the river. Suddenly, he was at the bank and going far too fast to stop. He leapt out across the water, hoping against hope to reach the other bank. But long before he was even halfway across, he fell and tumbled down and down into the cold, dark depths of the river. He thought his lungs would burst, so long was he going down. Finally, he tried to swim upwards, threshing his little paws, which were very good for running and not at all for swimming. And he found himself wriggling and flashing and swimming faster than an arrow until he broke the surface in a great leap. And he looked down at his paws to find them become the silver fins of a great salmon. Eagerly he leapt ahead into the water and swam upstream as fast. And then he found he could hear her through his skin. He leapt again and saw a great brown otter swimming as fast as she could after him, and he turned again into the stream and forced his way ahead. Next thing he knew was the great rumbling and crashing of the weir. Water tumbled and fell on him, throwing him every which way. Frantically he leapt again, up and up into the air, so that he could see the top of the weir. But he could not make it, and fell back again into the raging pool at its feet. Again he leapt up, striving to see over the top of the weir into the deep pool above. And again he fell back. A third time he leapt, struggling, threshing his body now in an effort to swim up through the air, even flapping his fins. And then he found himself borne upwards as a great sweep of wings bore him up into the air. Looking at his arms, he found them pearly grey and feathered, and he knew himself to have become a racing pigeon. He pressed his wings into the air and flew for all he was worth. And then he heard the cry. the hawk over his head. Glancing upwards, he could see Ceridwen as a tersel, flying round and round above him, making ready to stoop. Gwion despaired. He closed his eyes and his wings and plummeted down towards the great barn below him. Somehow his tiny body found a hole in the roof, and he found himself landed upon a great pile of wheat. And in that moment he knew that he too was a grain of wheat. Desperately, he hoped to hide in the multitude of grains and never be found again. Ceridwen saw him fall and shrieked her rage. She too closed her wings, but hers was a planned stoop, and she dove through the hole in the roof after Gwion Bach and landed in the pile of wheat. She said, for she had become a beautiful glossy brown hen with two great red combs. She scratched with one bright yellow claw, turning over and over the grains of wheat. Slowly, oh, so slowly, she made her way, grain by grain, through the pile, until she found him. And then, she clucked and swallowed him down. Ceridwen had eaten Gwion Bach. Soon, she felt herself swelling and found herself growing over the following 9 months as Gwion grew again in her belly. And as the 9 months came to pass, so she was delivered of a beautiful boy. Oh, he was so beautiful. His brow shone as though the light of the moon and the sun were behind his eyes. But Ceridwen could not keep him. Oh no. She still loved her Morfran, her beloved crow, and she would have none of this beautiful boy. But she would not kill him either. So she took a leather bag and sewed the baby up inside. Then she took the bag down to the river and cast it in. For 3 days and 3 nights, the bag floated down the river until on May Eve it came to rest against the weir. Now then, you remember Melgwyn, whose horses had died from drinking the poison brew that had come from the cauldron when Gwion Bach had sucked the 3 drops of wisdom from his thumb? Well, Melgwyn had a son called Elphin. Elphin was not much of a son. He was a wastrel lad, but with a good heart and a good wife. Now Melgwyn, in the hopes of putting his son in the way of some money and some profit, sent him down to the weir on this May Eve to catch the salmon. For it was said there was always a good catch of salmon at the weir on May Eve. So Elphin took his horse and went and sat by the river with his lines and his nets. And he sat, and he sat, and he sat, and no salmon showed itself. Even the minnows laughed and swam beneath the stones as they saw him approached. But Elphin sat on until the moon was high in the sky. And as he looked at the weir, he saw something bumping against the stones, and he thought he heard a faint cry. He strode out into the water and came up to where the thing was and saw it to be a leather bag. He picked it up. It felt lumpy and something wiggled, live inside. And then he heard the cry again. He carried it to the bank and took out his knife and cut the leather thongs which held it together. And as soon as he had cut them, he found himself holding a baby. It was the most beautiful child he had ever seen. "You are Shining Brow," he said, staring down into the baby's bright eyes. "I am indeed," the baby replied, and Elphin was so surprised he nearly dropped the child back into the water again. The child sang to Elphin, and Elphin took him home. and reared him as his son. And the child prophesied that Elphin had found, something of far more worth than any catch of salmon. Both Elphin and his wife were well satisfied with the catch, for the boy grew and became a great bard and a great wise man, and knew all of everything that ever lives. He was a wonder in his own land. When 13 years had gone by, it came about that Elphin was in great trouble. And Taliesin saved his life. But that is another story. So there we are. Shining Brow, the story of Taliesin. And that's it for this week. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I will be back next Wednesday with another story. Until then, see you on the other side.